Question 1. Research into the sale of a cellular tower site in Alabama reveals that the current owner has a long-term lease agreement with the landowner. The buyer is eager to complete the transaction quickly. Which of the following approaches best ensures compliance with Alabama communications law regarding ownership rules and restrictions? Option A. Rely exclusively on Federal Communications Commission (FCC) regulations, as they govern all aspects of cellular tower operations and ownership changes nationwide. Option B. Conduct a thorough review of Alabama statutes and APSC regulations pertaining to telecommunications, infrastructure ownership and transfer, perform comprehensive due diligence on the tower site and existing agreements, and ensure all state-specific notification and approval requirements are met before finalizing the transfer. Option C. Treat the transaction as a standard commercial real estate sale, applying general property transfer laws without specific consideration for Alabama's telecommunications infrastructure regulations. Option D. Proceed with the transfer based solely on the terms of the existing lease agreement, assuming it adequately covers all aspects of ownership transfer for telecommunications infrastructure. The correct answer is B. Conduct a thorough review of Alabama statutes and APSC regulations pertaining to telecommunications infrastructure ownership and transfer, perform comprehensive due diligence on the tower site and existing agreements, and ensure all state-specific notification and approval requirements are met before finalizing the transfer. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires navigating the complex ownership rules and restrictions governing telecommunications infrastructure in Alabama, specifically concerning the transfer of ownership of a cellular tower site. Misinterpreting or misapplying these regulations can lead to significant legal penalties, operational disruptions, and reputational damage for the parties involved. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with Alabama law. The best professional practice involves a thorough review of all applicable Alabama statutes and regulations pertaining to telecommunications infrastructure ownership and transfer. This includes examining the Alabama Code, specifically Title 37, Public Utilities, and any relevant regulations promulgated by the Alabama Public Service Commission, APSC, or other state agencies that oversee communications infrastructure. The process should involve identifying any specific requirements for notification, approval, or licensing related to the sale or transfer of such assets. Furthermore, a comprehensive due diligence process should be undertaken to confirm that the seller has clear title, and that all necessary permits and easements are in order, and that the transfer adheres to any existing contractual obligations or regulatory mandates concerning ownership changes. This approach ensures that the transaction is legally sound and compliant with Alabama's specific regulatory framework for telecommunications assets. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the transfer based solely on the existing lease agreement between the current tower owner and the landowner, without investigating Alabama's specific statutory requirements for the transfer of ownership of telecommunications infrastructure. This fails to acknowledge that lease agreements operate within the broader legal framework of state law, and Alabama may have specific regulations governing the transfer of ownership of such critical infrastructure that supersede or supplement private contractual terms. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that federal regulations under the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, are sufficient, and that no additional state-specific approvals are necessary for the ownership transfer of a cellular tower. While the FCC has broad authority over interstate and international communications, state laws and regulations often govern the physical siting, construction, and ownership transfer of telecommunications infrastructure within their borders, particularly concerning real property rights and public utility aspects. Alabama law may impose specific requirements that are not preempted by federal law. A further incorrect approach would be to rely on general real estate transfer practices without considering the unique nature of telecommunications infrastructure as a public utility asset. The sale of a cellular tower site may involve considerations beyond typical property transactions, such as ensuring continuity of service, compliance with environmental regulations related to tower operation, and adherence to any state-mandated public interest obligations associated with telecommunications providers. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes a comprehensive understanding of the specific regulatory environment. This involves 1. Identifying the relevant jurisdiction, Alabama, and its governing bodies, e.g., APSC. 2. researching all applicable state statutes and regulations related to telecommunications infrastructure ownership and transfer. 3. Conducting thorough due diligence on the asset and the parties involved. 4. Seeking legal counsel specializing in Alabama communications law to interpret regulations and ensure compliance. 5. Documenting all steps taken and approvals obtained. Question 2. The risk matrix shows a moderate likelihood of a privacy claim arising from a proposed marketing campaign in Alabama that involves collecting customer contact information from third-party data brokers and using it to send unsolicited promotional emails. Which of the following approaches best mitigates the potential for an invasion of privacy claim under Alabama law? Option A. Proactively obtaining explicit consent from individuals before adding them to the marketing list and sending promotional emails, ensuring they understand how their data was obtained and how to opt out. Option B. Proceeding with the campaign, assuming that general data protection policies are adequate and that unsolicited marketing emails are a common business practice. Option C. Relying on the terms of service agreed to by customers with the third-party data brokers, assuming this grants sufficient permission for marketing. Option D. Sending a single email notification to all recipients after the fact, informing them they are on a marketing list, and providing an opt-out link. Correct answer is A. Proactively obtaining explicit consent from individuals before adding them to the marketing list and sending promotional emails, ensuring they understand how their data was obtained and how to opt out. Explanation. The risk matrix shows a moderate likelihood of a privacy claim arising from the proposed marketing campaign. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing legitimate business interests in customer outreach with the fundamental right to privacy, as protected under Alabama law. Misjudging this balance can lead to significant legal repercussions, reputational damage, and erosion of customer trust. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with the specific nuances of Alabama's privacy statutes and common law principles. The best approach involves proactively obtaining explicit consent from individuals before collecting and using their personal information for marketing purposes, particularly when that information is obtained through non-public means or is sensitive in nature. This aligns with the principles of informed consent, a cornerstone of privacy protection. Alabama law, while not having a single comprehensive privacy statute like some other states, recognizes common law torts for invasion of privacy, including intrusion upon seclusion and public disclosure of private facts. Obtaining explicit consent minimizes the risk of claims related to unauthorized intrusion or the dissemination of private information without permission. This proactive measure demonstrates a commitment to respecting individual privacy rights and adhering to ethical marketing practices. An approach that relies solely on implied consent or assumes consent based on a pre-existing business relationship without clear notification and an opt-out mechanism is professionally unacceptable. This fails to meet the standard of informed consent and significantly increases the risk of an intrusion upon seclusion claim, where an individual's private affairs are intruded upon in a way that would be highly offensive to a reasonable person. Furthermore, if the marketing campaign involves sharing customer data with third parties without explicit consent, it could lead to claims of public disclosure of private facts, especially if the information disclosed is not already public knowledge and is considered private. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to proceed with the marketing campaign without any specific privacy review, assuming that general data protection measures are sufficient. This overlooks the specific requirements and potential liabilities under Alabama law concerning the collection and use of personal information for marketing. It fails to consider the potential for offensive intrusion or the disclosure of private information, which are key elements of invasion of privacy torts recognized in Alabama. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough assessment of the data being collected, the methods of collection, the intended use of the data, and the potential impact on individuals' privacy. This assessment should be guided by an understanding of relevant state laws, such as those in Alabama, and ethical best practices. Prioritizing explicit, informed consent, providing clear opt-out mechanisms, and conducting privacy impact assessments before launching marketing initiatives are crucial steps in mitigating legal and ethical risks. Question 3. Cost-benefit analysis shows that while swift dissemination of information is often desirable, the legal and ethical ramifications of defamation in Alabama necessitate careful consideration of the subject's public or private status. An investigative journalist in Birmingham, Alabama, is preparing to publish an article about a local business owner who has recently been involved in a contentious zoning dispute that has garnered significant local media attention. The journalist has gathered information suggesting the business owner may have engaged in unethical, though not necessarily illegal, business practices related to the dispute. The journalist believes the public has a right to know about these practices due to the zoning issue's impact on the community. Which of the following approaches best balances the public's right to know with the business owner's potential right to privacy and protection from defamation under Alabama law? Option A. Classify the business owner as a public figure due to their involvement in a local controversy of public interest and proceed with publishing the article, requiring the plaintiff to prove actual malice if a defamation suit is filed. Option B. Treat the business owner as a private figure and apply a negligence standard, ensuring the journalist exercised reasonable care in verifying the information before publication. Option C. Prioritize the potential for public interest in the business owner's practices and publish the information without extensive verification, assuming the business owner is unlikely to sue due to the public nature of the dispute. Option D. Focus solely on the public interest of the zoning dispute and assume that any individual involved in such a dispute automatically becomes a public figure, regardless of their prior status. The correct answer is A. Classify the business owner as a public figure due to their involvement in a local controversy of public interest and proceed with publishing the article, requiring the plaintiff to prove actual malice if a defamation suit is filed. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of Alabama defamation law, specifically the distinction between public figures and private figures, and how that distinction impacts the burden of proof for a plaintiff alleging defamation. The core difficulty lies in accurately categorizing the individual and applying the correct legal standard, which directly affects the likelihood of a successful lawsuit and the ethical considerations for the communicator. The correct approach involves a thorough assessment of the individual's status under Alabama law. This means determining if the individual has voluntarily injected themselves into a public controversy or achieved pervasive fame or notoriety, thereby becoming a public figure. If they are deemed a public figure, the plaintiff must prove actual malice, meaning the statement was made with knowledge of its falsity or with reckless disregard for the truth. This standard is high and protects robust public discourse, aligning with First Amendment principles as interpreted by Alabama courts. The ethical justification for this approach is rooted in the principle of protecting free speech and the press from undue chilling effects, while still providing recourse for genuine harm caused by false statements. An incorrect approach would be to assume that any individual discussed in a public forum is automatically a private figure. This would lead to applying a lower standard of proof for the plaintiff, often negligence, where the defendant failed to exercise reasonable care in verifying the truth of the statement. This is ethically problematic because it can unfairly burden individuals or entities who are not public figures but are nonetheless subject to public scrutiny, potentially leading to unwarranted litigation and stifling legitimate communication. Another incorrect approach is to conflate the subject matter of the communication with the status of the individual. Even if the topic is of public interest, the individual being discussed might still be a private figure. Applying the public figure standard in such a case would be a misapplication of the law and could leave a defamed private individual without adequate legal remedy. Finally, an incorrect approach is to focus solely on the potential for public interest in the individual, without considering their level of voluntary participation in public controversies or their pervasive fame. Alabama law requires more than just being the subject of public interest. It requires a certain level of engagement with public affairs or widespread recognition to be classified as a public figure. Professional decision-making in similar situations requires a systematic process. First, identify the core assertion being made. Second, research the subject of the assertion to determine their status as a public or private figure under Alabama law, considering their level of fame, notoriety, and voluntary participation in public controversies. Third, apply the appropriate legal standard for defamation, actual malice for public figures, negligence for private figures. And fourth, weigh the potential legal and ethical ramifications of proceeding with the communication, particularly concerning the accuracy and verification of the information. Question 4. Market research demonstrates that a significant portion of the Alabama public is interested in the personal financial dealings of local elected officials, even those unrelated to their official duties. A journalist obtains, through a private investigator, detailed records of an Alabama mayor's off-the-books investments and personal spending habits that are not illegal, but are considered embarrassing and highly private. The journalist believes this information is of public interest due to the mayor's position. Which approach best navigates the legal and ethical considerations under Alabama communications law regarding public disclosure of private facts? Option A. Refrain from publishing the information, recognizing that while true and potentially interesting, the private financial dealings are not directly related to the mayor's official duties or a matter of legitimate public concern in Alabama, and their disclosure would be an unwarranted invasion of privacy. Option B. Publish the information, as it is true and the mayor is a public figure, making all aspects of their life subject to public scrutiny. Option C. Publish only the portions of the financial dealings that are demonstrably linked to the mayor's official responsibilities, while omitting the purely personal and embarrassing details. Option D. Publish the information, arguing that the public's interest in the financial dealings of elected officials, regardless of their direct relation to official duties, justifies the disclosure. The correct answer is D. Publish the information, arguing that the public's interest in the financial dealings of elected officials, regardless of their direct relation to official duties, justifies the disclosure. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it pits the desire to inform the public against the fundamental right to privacy. The Alabama communications law, particularly concerning public disclosure of private facts, requires a delicate balance. Professionals must understand that not all private information, even if true and of potential public interest, can be disseminated without consequence. The key is to assess whether the disclosed information is genuinely of legitimate public concern or merely sensationalized private details. The best professional approach involves a thorough assessment of the information's newsworthiness and its relation to a matter of legitimate public concern within Alabama. This means evaluating whether the private facts disclosed are intrinsically related to a public issue, a public figure's official conduct, or a matter that the public has a right or need to know about. If the information is merely embarrassing or offensive and does not serve a genuine public interest, its disclosure would likely violate Alabama law. This approach prioritizes legal compliance and ethical responsibility by focusing on the substance and relevance of the private information to the public sphere. Disclosing the information solely because it is true and potentially interesting to a segment of the public is professionally unacceptable. Alabama law does not permit the dissemination of private facts simply because they are sensational. This approach fails to consider the legitimate public concern element, which is a critical defense against claims of public disclosure of private facts. It prioritizes sensationalism over privacy rights and legal boundaries. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to disclose the information after obtaining it through questionable or intrusive means, even if it is deemed to be of public concern. While the content might have some public interest, the method of acquisition can independently raise legal and ethical issues, potentially leading to claims beyond just public disclosure of private facts, such as invasion of privacy through intrusion. Finally, assuming that because the information is about a public figure, all private details are fair game for disclosure is also a flawed approach. While public figures have a reduced expectation of privacy regarding their public conduct and matters directly related to their public roles, this does not grant carte blanche to disclose any and all private facts about them, especially those unrelated to their public duties or matters of legitimate public concern. Alabama law still protects private facts that are not relevant to the public interest. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the nature of the information, private vs. public. If private, the next step is to rigorously assess its newsworthiness and its connection to a matter of legitimate public concern within Alabama. This involves asking, is this information essential for the public to know to make informed decisions or understand public affairs? If the answer is no, or if the information is primarily embarrassing and sensational, disclosure should be avoided. Furthermore, consider the method of acquisition and the potential harm to the individual. Ethical guidelines and legal counsel should be consulted when in doubt. Question 5. The monitoring system demonstrates an employee's internal email discussing a sensitive client project, which, when taken out of context and shared with a limited group of colleagues not directly involved in the project, could be interpreted as the employee making disparaging and inaccurate remarks about the client's financial stability. Considering Alabama communications law regarding false light, which of the following represents the most prudent and legally sound course of action for the company? Option A. Immediately dismiss the employee based on the perceived disparaging remarks, assuming the out-of-context sharing is sufficient evidence of misconduct. Option B. Conduct a thorough, objective review of the email, considering its original context and the potential for a reasonable person to interpret the out-of-context sharing as highly offensive and false, and consult with legal counsel before taking any further action. Option C. Forward the email to the client directly, informing them of the employee's alleged disparaging remarks without further internal investigation. Option D. Ignore the situation, assuming that internal company communications are not subject to false light claims and that the employee's remarks were made in a private capacity. The correct answer is B. Conduct a thorough, objective review of the email, considering its original context and the potential for a reasonable person to interpret the out-of-context sharing as highly offensive and false, and consult with legal counsel before taking any further action. Explanation. The monitoring system demonstrates a scenario professionally challenging due to the inherent tension between legitimate business interests in monitoring employee communications and the individual's right to privacy and protection from reputational harm. The Alabama communications law, particularly concerning torts like false light, requires a delicate balance. Employers must be aware that even if communications are made on company systems, the content and the manner in which it is disseminated or perceived can lead to liability if it places an individual in a false light before the public. The challenge lies in identifying when monitoring crosses the line from legitimate oversight to actionable misrepresentation. The best approach involves a thorough, objective review of the communication in question, considering its context and potential for misinterpretation by a reasonable person. This approach prioritizes factual accuracy and avoids subjective assumptions or emotional responses. Specifically, it requires examining whether the communication, when viewed in its entirety and in context, would lead a reasonable person to believe something false about the individual that would be highly offensive to a reasonable person. This aligns with the principles of Alabama tort law, which focuses on the offensiveness and falsity of the portrayal. The employer's duty is to ensure that any internal or external perception of an employee derived from monitored communications is not based on misleading or fabricated information that causes reputational damage. An incorrect approach would be to immediately assume the communication is harmless or a mere misunderstanding without further investigation. This fails to acknowledge the potential for a false light claim, which does not require malice or intent to harm, only that the portrayal is false and highly offensive. Another incorrect approach is to focus solely on whether the communication was made on company property, implying that all such communications are automatically unprotected. Alabama law does not grant employers carte blanche to misrepresent employees simply because the communication occurred on a work device. Furthermore, an approach that involves sharing the communication with other employees without a legitimate business need, thereby broadening the audience and increasing the potential for reputational harm, is also professionally unacceptable. This action exacerbates the potential for a false light claim by increasing the number of people who might perceive the individual in a misleading and offensive manner. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a presumption of potential harm when reviewing employee communications that could be misconstrued. This involves gathering all relevant facts, considering the communication from the perspective of a reasonable observer, and consulting legal counsel when there is any doubt about the potential for a false light claim. The focus should always be on preventing the creation or dissemination of false impressions that are highly offensive, rather than reacting after a claim has been made. Question 6. Which approach would be most appropriate for an Alabama-based marketing firm seeking to feature a local celebrity in an upcoming advertising campaign to promote a new product, while ensuring strict adherence to Alabama communications law regarding appropriation of name or likeness? Option A. Use the celebrity's name and likeness in the campaign and inform them of the usage afterward, offering a small gift as a gesture of goodwill. Option B. Assume consent is granted because the celebrity is a public figure and has previously appeared in local media. Option C. Utilize the celebrity's name and likeness in a way that is only indirectly linked to the product's commercial benefit, believing this distinction will avoid legal issues. Option D. Secure a written agreement with the celebrity that clearly outlines the scope, duration, and compensation for the use of their name and likeness in the advertising campaign. The correct answer is D. Secure a written agreement with the celebrity that clearly outlines the scope, duration, and compensation for the use of their name and likeness in the advertising campaign. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it involves balancing a business's legitimate interest in marketing with an individual's fundamental right to privacy and control over their own identity. The use of a person's name or likeness for commercial gain without consent can lead to significant legal repercussions and damage to professional reputation. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with Alabama law and ethical business practices. The best approach involves obtaining explicit, informed consent from the individual before using their name or likeness for any commercial purpose. This means clearly explaining how their name or likeness will be used, for what duration, and for what benefit to the business. This approach is correct because Alabama law, specifically under statutes addressing the right of privacy and appropriation, protects individuals from the unauthorized commercial exploitation of their identity. Obtaining consent is the most robust defense against claims of appropriation and ensures ethical conduct by respecting individual autonomy. An approach that assumes consent based on the individual's public profile or past interactions is professionally unacceptable. This fails to meet the legal standard for consent, which must be affirmative and informed. Relying on assumptions can lead to violations of Alabama's appropriation laws, as the law generally requires clear permission, not implied acquiescence. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to use a name or likeness in a way that is only tangentially related to a commercial purpose, believing this might circumvent appropriation laws. This is a flawed strategy because Alabama law broadly defines commercial purpose to include advertising, merchandising, or any other activity that benefits the user of the name or likeness. Even indirect commercial benefit can trigger liability. Finally, an approach that uses a name or likeness and then offers a small token of appreciation or a later payment after the fact is also professionally unacceptable. While such gestures might be intended to mitigate potential issues, they do not substitute for prior, informed consent. Alabama law focuses on the unauthorized use itself, and post hoc compensation does not retroactively legitimize an unlawful appropriation. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes obtaining explicit, written consent for any use of an individual's name or likeness in a commercial context. This involves a proactive due diligence process, understanding the specific requirements of Alabama's appropriation and privacy laws, and consulting legal counsel when in doubt. The default position should always be to seek permission, rather than to seek forgiveness after the fact. Question 7. Investigation of a complaint alleging that a local Alabama radio station is broadcasting content that some listeners find offensive. The Alabama Public Service Commission is considering implementing new rules. What regulatory approach should the Commission prioritize to ensure compliance with both its statutory mandate and the First Amendment? Option A. Develop regulations that focus on the technical aspects of broadcasting, such as signal quality and interference, and establish clear procedures for addressing listener complaints about deceptive advertising practices, without regard to the specific content of the programming. Option B. Implement a system where the Commission pre-approves all programming content deemed potentially controversial before it can be aired. Option C. Create broad restrictions on all forms of advertising that could be perceived as misleading, even if the advertising is not demonstrably false or deceptive. Option D. Prohibit the broadcast of any programming that receives a significant number of listener complaints, regardless of whether the content violates existing obscenity or incitement laws. The correct answer is A. Develop regulations that focus on the technical aspects of broadcasting, such as signal quality and interference, and establish clear procedures for addressing listener complaints about deceptive advertising practices, without regard to the specific content of the programming. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because the Alabama Public Service Commission (APSC) must balance the public interest in regulating telecommunications services with the First Amendment rights of broadcasters. The core of the challenge lies in distinguishing between regulations that target the content of speech and those that regulate the time, place, or manner of speech, which have different constitutional tests. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any regulatory action is narrowly tailored and serves a compelling government interest without unduly burdening protected speech. The best approach involves a content-neutral regulatory framework. This approach recognizes that the APSC has a legitimate interest in ensuring the efficient and equitable distribution of communication resources and preventing deceptive practices. By focusing on the operational aspects of broadcasting, such as signal interference, technical standards, or the allocation of broadcast spectrum, rather than the messages being conveyed, the APSC can implement regulations that are permissible under the First Amendment. This is because content-neutral regulations are subject to intermediate scrutiny, requiring them to serve a substantial government interest and be narrowly tailored to achieve that interest. The APSC mandate to regulate public utilities and communication services in Alabama provides a substantial government interest in maintaining order and preventing harm in the broadcast environment. An approach that prioritizes regulating the content of specific broadcasts, such as requiring the removal of programming deemed objectionable or harmful without a clear and present danger standard, is constitutionally flawed. Such an approach would constitute a content-based regulation, which is subject to strict scrutiny. Under strict scrutiny, the government must demonstrate that the regulation is necessary to serve a compelling government interest and is narrowly tailored to achieve that interest. The APSC authority does not extend to censoring speech based on its message, as this would violate the First Amendment's protection of free speech. Another incorrect approach would be to implement regulations that are overly broad and restrict a substantial amount of protected speech, even if the intent is to address a specific problem. For example, a regulation that broadly prohibits certain types of advertising without sufficient justification, or that imposes burdensome licensing requirements on all broadcasters regardless of their operational conduct, would likely be deemed unconstitutional. This fails to be narrowly tailored and could be seen as an impermissible restriction on speech. Finally, an approach that relies on vague or subjective criteria for enforcement, allowing for arbitrary application of rules, would also be problematic. Regulations must be clear and specific to provide fair notice to broadcasters and prevent discriminatory enforcement, which is a fundamental aspect of due process and regulatory fairness. Professionals in this field should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the specific regulatory objective. They must then assess whether the proposed regulation targets the content of speech or the conduct of the broadcaster. If the objective is to regulate content, they must recognize the high constitutional bar and consider if less restrictive means are available. If the objective is to regulate conduct, they must ensure the regulation is content-neutral, serves a substantial government interest, and is narrowly tailored. Consulting legal counsel specializing in communications law and the First Amendment is crucial throughout this process to ensure compliance with both state and federal law. Question 8. Assessment of the regulatory framework in Alabama. A telecommunications company plans to construct several new cell towers across rural counties. The company's internal project management team believes they have a solid grasp of general telecommunications infrastructure regulations, but are unsure about the specific procedural steps required by the Alabama Public Service Commission, APSC, for new tower deployments. What is the most prudent approach to ensure compliance with Alabama's communications law and APSC guidelines? Option A. Initiate the formal application process with the Alabama Public Service Commission, including all required documentation for new tower construction, and await their approval before commencing any physical work. Option B. Proceed with tower construction based on a general understanding of telecommunications regulations and submit a notification to the APSC only after all towers are fully operational. Option C. Focus solely on obtaining necessary permits from individual county governments, assuming these local approvals are sufficient for tower deployment under Alabama law. Option D. Begin construction immediately and address any potential APSC concerns or requirements on an ad hoc basis as they arise during the construction phase. The correct answer is A. Initiate the formal application process with the Alabama Public Service Commission, including all required documentation for new tower construction, and await their approval before commencing any physical work. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate need for network expansion with the strict regulatory requirements of the Alabama Public Service Commission (APSC) concerning the deployment of new communication infrastructure. Failure to adhere to these regulations can lead to significant penalties, project delays, and damage to the company's reputation. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance while pursuing business objectives. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves proactively engaging with the apps to understand and fulfill all pre-approval requirements for new tower construction. This approach prioritizes regulatory compliance by initiating the necessary application processes, environmental impact assessments, and community notification procedures, as mandated by Alabama law and APSC guidelines, before commencing any physical work. This ensures that the project aligns with established legal frameworks, minimizing the risk of future disputes or enforcement actions. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to proceed with construction based on a preliminary understanding of general telecommunications regulations, assuming that specific APSC approval will be a mere formality after the fact. This fails to acknowledge the specific procedural mandates of the APSC, which often require detailed submissions and approvals prior to any physical construction. This can lead to violations of Alabama's communication infrastructure laws and APSC orders, potentially resulting in fines or injunctions. Another incorrect approach is to prioritize speed of deployment by commencing construction and then attempting to retroactively seek APSC approval or inform the Commission of the completed work. This disregards the principle of prior authorization inherent in regulatory oversight. Alabama law and APSC regulations are designed to allow for review and potential modification of plans before they impact the public interest or environment, and bypassing this process undermines the regulatory framework. A further incorrect approach is to rely solely on local municipal permits for tower construction, assuming these supersede or encompass state-level APSC requirements. While local permits are necessary, Alabama's regulatory framework for communication infrastructure often involves state-level oversight by the APSC to ensure broader public interest, safety, and service standards are met. Ignoring APSC jurisdiction in favor of solely local approvals is a direct contravention of state law. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field should adopt a proactive and compliance-first decision-making framework. This involves thoroughly researching all applicable state and federal regulations, specifically those governed by the Alabama Public Service Commission, before initiating any project phase. Engaging legal counsel and regulatory affairs specialists early in the planning process is crucial. A systematic approach would include 1. Identifying all relevant regulatory bodies and their specific requirements. 2. Developing a comprehensive compliance plan that maps project activities to regulatory obligations. 3. Seeking pre-approval and necessary permits from all mandated agencies, including the APSC, before commencing construction. 4. Maintaining detailed records of all communications and submissions to regulatory bodies. Question 9. Benchmark analysis indicates that a telecommunications provider in Alabama is planning a significant expansion of its 5G network infrastructure. What is the most appropriate regulatory policy and procedure to ensure compliance with the Alabama Public Service Commission's requirements? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive impact assessment covering infrastructure, public safety, and market competition, followed by a formal submission to the Alabama Public Service Commission detailing findings and proposed mitigation strategies. Option B. Rely on general federal communications regulations, assuming they preempt specific state-level procedural requirements for infrastructure expansion within Alabama. Option C. Proceed with the network expansion based on internal risk assessments, assuming existing regulations adequately cover the new technology. Option D. Submit a brief notification to the Alabama Public Service Commission stating the intent to expand, without a detailed impact analysis. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive impact assessment covering infrastructure, public safety, and market competition, followed by a formal submission to the Alabama Public Service Commission detailing findings and proposed mitigation strategies. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between a company's desire to rapidly deploy new communication technologies and the Alabama Public Service Commission's APSC mandate to ensure public safety, service reliability, and fair competition. Navigating these competing interests requires a thorough understanding of the app's regulatory policies and procedures. The core of the challenge lies in balancing innovation with compliance, ensuring that technological advancements do not inadvertently create new risks or undermine existing regulatory frameworks designed to protect Alabama consumers and the integrity of the communication infrastructure. The best approach involves proactively engaging with the apps to understand their specific requirements and concerns regarding the proposed deployment of the new 5G network. This includes conducting a comprehensive impact assessment that analyzes potential effects on existing infrastructure, emergency services, consumer privacy, and competitive market dynamics within Alabama. Following this, a formal submission to the apps detailing the findings of the impact assessment and proposing mitigation strategies for any identified concerns is crucial. This approach aligns with the app's procedural requirements for introducing new services and demonstrates a commitment to regulatory compliance and responsible innovation. It allows for collaborative problem-solving and ensures that the deployment proceeds with regulatory approval and public confidence. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the deployment without prior consultation or submission to the apps, relying solely on internal risk assessments. This fails to acknowledge the app's oversight authority and the procedural requirements for significant infrastructure changes. Such an action could lead to regulatory penalties, forced service interruptions, and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach is to submit a superficial impact assessment that downplays potential negative consequences or fails to address key areas of apps concern, such as spectrum interference or universal service obligation. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and a disregard for the thoroughness expected by the regulatory body, potentially leading to delays or outright rejection of the deployment plan. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to interpret existing regulations in isolation without considering the app's established precedents and ongoing policy discussions regarding emerging technologies. This narrow interpretation risks overlooking critical nuances and failing to anticipate the app's specific expectations for 5G deployment in Alabama. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that prioritizes understanding the regulatory landscape, engaging proactively with the relevant authorities, and conducting thorough, transparent assessments. This involves identifying all applicable regulations, consulting with legal and regulatory affairs experts, and developing a clear communication strategy with the apps. The goal is to build a collaborative relationship that facilitates innovation while ensuring compliance and protecting public interest. Question 10. Process analysis reveals that a telecommunications company in Alabama is considering analyzing aggregated customer usage data to identify trends in service utilization. The data has undergone a process intended to anonymize it by removing direct identifiers. However, there is a theoretical possibility of re-identifying individuals or small groups by cross-referencing with other publicly available datasets, which could reveal patterns of communication that a reasonable person might find highly offensive. The company needs to determine the acceptable level of residual risk before proceeding with the analysis. If the probability of successful re-identification is estimated at 0.02, and the potential offensiveness score of revealed patterns is 0.8 on a scale of 0 to 1. What is the calculated privacy risk score, PRS? Using the formula \PRS equals P \text re-identification \times S \text offensiveness \. And what is the most appropriate course of action based on a threshold of 0.05 for acceptable risk? Option A. The privacy risk score is 0.16. Proceed with the analysis as the PRS is below the acceptable threshold of 0.05, indicating a low probability of highly offensive intrusion. Option B. The privacy risk score is 0.16. Proceed with the analysis but implement additional monitoring to track any potential privacy breaches, as the PRS is close to the acceptable threshold. Option C. The privacy risk score is 0.16. Halt the analysis immediately and conduct further, more robust anonymization, as any PRS, regardless of the threshold, signifies a potential privacy violation. Option D. The privacy risk score is 0.02. Proceed with the analysis as the PRS is below the acceptable threshold of 0.05, and the data is considered anonymized. The correct answer is A. The privacy risk score is 0.16. Proceed with the analysis as the PRS is below the acceptable threshold of 0.05, indicating a low probability of highly offensive intrusion. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the legitimate business need for data analysis with the fundamental right to privacy under Alabama law. The core difficulty lies in quantifying the potential harm and the extent of intrusion, especially when dealing with aggregated, anonymized data that might still be susceptible to re-identification or reveal sensitive patterns. The professional must navigate the nuances of what constitutes seclusion and highly offensive under Alabama's tort of intrusion upon seclusion, considering both the method of data acquisition and its subsequent use. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a proactive, risk mitigation strategy that prioritizes minimizing potential intrusion and ensuring data integrity. This approach focuses on a thorough assessment of the data's sensitivity, the methods of anonymization and aggregation, and the potential for re-identification. It necessitates a quantitative analysis of the probability of intrusion and the potential severity of harm, aligning with the principles of data minimization and purpose limitation often embedded in privacy frameworks. Specifically, under Alabama law, the tort of intrusion upon seclusion requires a plaintiff to prove that the intrusion would be highly offensive to a reasonable person. By conducting a detailed impact assessment that quantifies the likelihood of re-identification and the potential for revealing private information, and by implementing robust anonymization techniques that demonstrably reduce these risks below a threshold of highly offensive, the company acts to prevent the tort from occurring. This approach is ethically sound as it respects individual privacy and legally defensible as it demonstrates a good faith effort to avoid actionable intrusion. The calculation of a privacy risk score, PRS, serves as a quantifiable metric to guide decision-making, where a PRS below a predetermined conservative threshold e.g. 0.05 indicates an acceptable level of risk. The formula for PRS could be \PRS equals P text re-identification times S text offensiveness where \P text re-identification is the probability of successful re-identification and S text offensiveness is a score representing the potential offensiveness of the revealed information, scaled from 0 to 1. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves proceeding with the data analysis without a formal, quantitative assessment of privacy risks, relying solely on the assertion that the data is anonymized. This fails to meet the professional standard because anonymization is not an absolute shield against claims of intrusion upon seclusion. Alabama courts would scrutinize the actual effectiveness of the anonymization process and whether it truly prevents the disclosure of private facts in a manner that would be highly offensive to a reasonable person. The lack of a quantifiable risk assessment means the company cannot demonstrate it took reasonable steps to avoid intrusion. Another incorrect approach is to assume that because the data is aggregated, it automatically eliminates any possibility of intrusion. Aggregation can still reveal sensitive patterns about groups of individuals, and if the aggregation process is flawed or if the underlying data contains unique identifiers that were not properly removed, re-identification remains a possibility. This approach neglects the potential for indirect intrusion and the highly offensive standard, which can be met even if individual identities are not explicitly revealed, but sensitive information about a person's habits or associations is exposed. A further incorrect approach is to focus solely on the cost of potential litigation rather than the ethical and legal imperative to protect privacy. While financial considerations are part of business, basing privacy decisions solely on cost-benefit analysis of lawsuits without a genuine commitment to preventing harm is ethically deficient and legally risky. This approach may lead to decisions that cut corners on privacy protection, increasing the likelihood of actual intrusion and subsequent legal action. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a proactive, risk-based approach to data privacy. This involves understanding the specific legal standards for privacy torts in their jurisdiction. Here, Alabama's intrusion upon seclusion, conducting thorough impact assessments that quantify potential risks, and implementing robust technical and procedural safeguards. Decision-making should be guided by a framework that prioritizes privacy by design and default, ensuring that data handling practices are not only compliant, but also ethically sound and demonstrably protective of individual rights. When in doubt, seeking legal counsel and erring on the side of greater privacy protection is the most prudent course of action. Question 11. Process analysis reveals that a broadcast station manager in Alabama is considering the installation of a new wireless microphone system for live event broadcasts. The vendor claims the system operates on frequencies that are not currently used by the station and are generally considered unlicensed for commercial use. The manager is contemplating proceeding with the installation without seeking explicit FCC approval, believing it to be a minor addition that won't impact licensed services. What is the most appropriate course of action for the station manager under Alabama communications law as governed by the FCC? Option A. Install the system and monitor for any interference complaints, intending to cease operation if any issues arise, as the system is considered low power and unlikely to cause significant problems. Option B. Immediately consult the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, to determine if the proposed wireless microphone system requires a license, modification to the station's existing license, or specific authorization, and adhere to their guidance before deployment. Option C. Proceed with the installation and operation of the wireless microphone system, relying on the vendor's assurance that it operates on unlicensed frequencies and will not cause interference. Option D. Assume that the station's existing broadcast license implicitly covers the use of any auxiliary wireless equipment, provided it does not directly transmit on the station's primary licensed frequency. The correct answer is B. Immediately consult the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, to determine if the proposed wireless microphone system requires a license, modification to the station's existing license, or specific authorization, and adhere to their guidance before deployment. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a broadcast station manager in Alabama concerning the potential for unauthorized spectrum usage. The core difficulty lies in balancing the station's operational needs with the strict regulatory framework established by the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, to prevent interference and ensure efficient spectrum allocation. Misinterpreting or ignoring FCC rules can lead to significant penalties, including fines, license revocation, and damage to the station's reputation. Careful judgment is required to assess the nature of the proposed equipment and its potential impact on licensed frequencies. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves proactively seeking clarification and authorization from the FCC before deploying any new equipment that transmits radio frequency signals. This approach acknowledges the FCC's exclusive authority over spectrum management in the United States. Specifically, it entails identifying the proposed equipment, understanding its operating frequencies and power levels, and then consulting the relevant FCC rules and regulations, e.g., Title 47 of the Code of Federal Regulations, to determine if a license modification, new license, or waiver is required. If the equipment operates on frequencies allocated for licensed services or could potentially cause interference, submitting an application to the FCC for approval is the mandatory and correct course of action. This demonstrates due diligence and adherence to the Communications Act of 1934, as amended, and FCC rules. Incorrect approaches analysis. Proceeding with the installation and operation of the equipment without FCC approval, based on a belief that it operates on unlicensed spectrum or that the station's existing license implicitly covers it, is a significant regulatory failure. The FCC's licensing regime is designed to prevent harmful interference, and operating unauthorized equipment, even if intended for a seemingly benign purpose, can disrupt licensed services. Relying on the assumption that the equipment is low power or unlicensed, without verifying its compliance with FCC Part 15 rules or other applicable regulations, is also a failure. Many devices that are considered unlicensed still have specific operational parameters that must be met, and exceeding these can still constitute a violation. Furthermore, assuming that a vendor's assurance of compliance is sufficient without independent verification or FCC authorization is a dereliction of the station manager's responsibility. The ultimate responsibility for compliance rests with the licensee. Professional reasoning. Professionals in broadcast management must adopt a proactive and compliance-oriented mindset. When considering the introduction of any new transmission technology, the decision-making process should begin with a thorough understanding of the FCC's regulatory authority. This involves 1. identifying the proposed technology and its intended function. 2. Researching the relevant FCC rules and regulations pertaining to the operating frequencies, power levels, and potential for interference. 3. Consulting with legal counsel or FCC compliance experts if there is any ambiguity. 4. Submitting necessary applications or notifications to the FCC for approval before deployment. This systematic approach minimizes risk and ensures adherence to the law. Question 12. The efficiency study reveals a significant portion of the Alabama-based broadcast station's programming budget is allocated to content with a demonstrably low viewership and advertising revenue. Management is considering substantial cuts to these programs to improve financial performance. Considering the Communications Act of 1934 and its implications for broadcast licensees in Alabama, what is the most responsible course of action for the station? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive review of the low-performing programs to assess their public interest value and explore alternative, more cost-effective methods of fulfilling public service obligations before making any programming decisions. Option B. Maintain the current programming schedule without alteration, arguing that the existing mix of content, regardless of individual program performance, has historically met regulatory requirements. Option C. Prioritize the station's financial health by cutting all programming not directly contributing to advertising revenue, as a profitable station is inherently better positioned to serve the public in the long run. Option D. Immediately reduce or eliminate the low-performing programs to reallocate funds towards higher revenue-generating content, assuming this will indirectly benefit the public by ensuring the station's financial viability. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive review of the low-performing programs to assess their public interest value and explore alternative, more cost-effective methods of fulfilling public service obligations before making any programming decisions. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate operational needs of a broadcasting entity with the long-term public interest obligations mandated by federal law, specifically the Communications Act of 1934 as interpreted by the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, in Alabama. The pressure to maintain advertising revenue can create a conflict with the duty to provide programming that serves the public interest, convenience, and necessity. Careful judgment is required to navigate these competing demands in a manner that is both legally compliant and ethically sound. The best approach involves proactively identifying and addressing potential public interest deficiencies in programming by conducting a thorough review of existing content against FCC guidelines and community needs assessments. This includes analyzing the diversity of programming, its relevance to the local Alabama community, and its accessibility. By taking these steps, the station demonstrates a commitment to fulfilling its public service obligations under the Communications Act, which requires licensees to operate in the public interest. This proactive stance allows for informed decision-making regarding future programming and resource allocation, ensuring compliance and fostering goodwill with the community and the FCC. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the efficiency study's findings as mere administrative concerns, without considering their implications for public interest obligations. The Communications Act of 1934, particularly Section 307A, mandates that broadcast licenses be granted, continued, and modified in the public interest. Failing to investigate potential programming gaps or underrepresentation of community needs, as suggested by the study, directly contravenes this mandate. It prioritizes financial efficiency over legal and ethical responsibilities, risking regulatory scrutiny and potential license renewal challenges. Another incorrect approach is to solely focus on reducing operational costs by cutting programming deemed less profitable, without a corresponding assessment of its public interest value. The Communications Act does not permit licensees to abdicate their public service responsibilities based on profitability alone. While financial viability is important for sustained operation, it cannot come at the expense of serving the public interest, convenience, and necessity, which are core tenets of broadcast licensing in Alabama. This approach risks creating a programming void that fails to serve diverse community segments, leading to potential FCC enforcement actions. A further incorrect approach is to assume that existing programming, regardless of its content or reach, automatically satisfies public interest requirements. The FCC expects licensees to actively ascertain and respond to the needs and interests of their communities. Simply continuing with the status quo without evaluating its effectiveness or identifying areas for improvement is insufficient. The Communications Act implies a dynamic obligation, requiring licensees to adapt their programming to evolving community needs and technological advancements, rather than maintaining a static approach. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the legal and ethical obligations under the Communications Act of 1934. This involves a thorough assessment of current practices against regulatory requirements and community needs. When faced with potential conflicts, such as those highlighted by an efficiency study, the framework should prioritize compliance and public service. This means conducting due diligence, seeking expert advice if necessary, and making decisions that demonstrably serve the public interest, even if they involve short-term costs or operational adjustments. Transparency with regulatory bodies and the public regarding efforts to meet public interest obligations is also a crucial component of responsible decision-making. Question 13. Strategic planning requires a telecommunications provider operating in Alabama to consider the implications of the Telecommunications Act of 1996 when developing a new, high-speed data service that utilizes advanced network technologies. The provider is concerned that the service's unique architecture might inadvertently create new barriers for smaller, competing internet service providers who rely on the incumbent's infrastructure for interconnection. What is the most prudent course of action for the provider to ensure compliance with federal and state telecommunications regulations? Option A. Proceed with launching the service as planned, assuming that the innovative nature of the technology exempts it from the older requirements of the Telecommunications Act of 1996. Option B. Focus solely on marketing the new service's benefits to consumers, deferring any regulatory compliance checks until a formal complaint is filed by a competitor or regulatory agency. Option C. Conduct a thorough legal and technical review to assess the new service's compliance with the Telecommunications Act of 1996 provisions on interconnection, unbundling, and non-discriminatory access, and proactively seek clarification from regulatory bodies if necessary. Option D. Implement the service with a pricing model that is slightly less favorable to competitors, rationalizing that the provider is entitled to a competitive advantage from its innovation. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough legal and technical review to assess the new service's compliance with the Telecommunications Act of 1996 provisions on interconnection, unbundling, and non-discriminatory access, and proactively seek clarification from regulatory bodies if necessary. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a telecommunications provider in Alabama due to the complex interplay of the Telecommunications Act of 1996 and evolving market dynamics. The provider must balance its desire to innovate and offer new services with its legal obligations to ensure fair competition and access, particularly concerning incumbent providers. Misinterpreting or disregarding the provisions of the Act can lead to significant legal repercussions, regulatory penalties, and damage to the company's reputation. Careful judgment is required to navigate these obligations while pursuing business objectives. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves proactively engaging with the regulatory framework established by the Telecommunications Act of 1996. This means thoroughly understanding the Act's provisions regarding interconnection, unbundling of network elements, and non-discriminatory access for competing carriers. A company pursuing this approach would conduct a comprehensive legal and technical review to identify any potential conflicts with existing obligations and develop a strategy that demonstrably complies with the Act's intent to foster competition. This includes seeking clarification from the Alabama Public Service Commission (APSC) or the Federal Communications Commission (FCC) if there is ambiguity, and designing the new service in a manner that does not create undue barriers for competitors or exploit market power in a way that violates the Act. This approach prioritizes legal compliance and promotes the Act's objectives of promoting competition and innovation. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves prioritizing the immediate launch of the new service without a thorough assessment of its impact on existing competitive obligations under the Telecommunications Act of 1996. This failure to conduct due diligence risks violating provisions related to fair access and interconnection, potentially leading to regulatory investigations and sanctions. Another incorrect approach is to assume that the Act's requirements are outdated and no longer relevant to modern telecommunications services. This dismissive attitude ignores the ongoing applicability of the Act and its amendments, exposing the company to legal challenges and penalties for non-compliance. The Act's principles of promoting competition remain foundational. A further incorrect approach is to implement the service in a way that subtly disadvantages competitors, such as through opaque pricing structures or technical limitations that are not readily apparent. While not an overt violation, such practices can be interpreted as an attempt to circumvent the spirit of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which aims to create a level playing field. This can lead to complaints and enforcement actions by regulatory bodies. Professional reasoning. Professionals in the telecommunications industry must adopt a proactive and compliance-oriented mindset. When introducing new services or technologies, the decision-making process should begin with a comprehensive review of applicable laws and regulations, specifically focusing on how the innovation aligns with or potentially impacts existing legal obligations. This involves consulting legal counsel specializing in telecommunications law, engaging with relevant regulatory bodies for guidance, and conducting thorough impact assessments. The goal is to integrate innovation within the legal framework, rather than attempting to operate outside of it. Question 14. Strategic planning requires a communications provider in Alabama to consider the constitutional implications of the content it disseminates. A client approaches your firm with a proposal to broadcast advertisements that, while not explicitly illegal on their face, push the boundaries of taste and could be interpreted by some as offensive or promoting harmful stereotypes. The client insists on absolute freedom to express their message, stating they are willing to accept any consequences. How should your firm advise this client regarding the dissemination of their advertisements in Alabama, considering the First Amendment and relevant state communications law? Option A. Recommend that your firm refuse to broadcast any content that might be considered controversial or offensive by any segment of the public, regardless of its legal status. Option B. Agree to broadcast all content the client provides, assuming that any potential legal issues will be resolved between the client and the relevant authorities without your firm's involvement. Option C. Inform the client that as long as they are paying for the service, your firm will broadcast any content they provide, and they alone will be responsible for any legal repercussions. Option D. Advise the client that, while Alabama law protects a wide range of expression, certain categories of speech, such as obscenity or incitement, are not constitutionally protected and therefore cannot be disseminated through your services, explaining the legal tests for these exceptions. The correct answer is D. Advise the client that, while Alabama law protects a wide range of expression, certain categories of speech, such as obscenity or incitement, are not constitutionally protected and therefore cannot be disseminated through your services, explaining the legal tests for these exceptions. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a communications provider in Alabama due to the potential conflict between a client's desire for unrestricted content and the constitutional limitations on speech, particularly concerning obscenity and incitement. Navigating this requires a deep understanding of the First Amendment's application to commercial speech and the specific legal precedents established in Alabama and federal law regarding what constitutes unprotected speech. The provider must balance client service with legal compliance and ethical responsibility to avoid legal repercussions and maintain public trust. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves advising the client that, while Alabama law generally protects broad expression, certain categories of speech are not constitutionally protected and therefore cannot be disseminated through the provider's services. This approach directly addresses the client's request by explaining the legal boundaries, specifically referencing the established legal tests for obscenity and incitement, which are exceptions to First Amendment protection. This is correct because it prioritizes legal compliance and ethical conduct by proactively informing the client of limitations rooted in constitutional law and established case law, thereby preventing potential violations. Incorrect approaches analysis. Advising the client that all content is permissible as long as it is paid for by the client fails to acknowledge the constitutional limitations on speech. This approach is incorrect because it ignores the fact that the First Amendment is not absolute and that certain categories of speech, such as obscenity, defamation, and incitement to violence, are not protected and can lead to legal liability for both the speaker and, potentially, the platform disseminating it. Suggesting that the provider can broadcast anything the client wishes, but that the client will bear all legal responsibility, is also an insufficient approach. The ultimate responsibility for illegal content often rests with the speaker. A communications provider has a professional and ethical obligation to avoid facilitating illegal activity. Knowingly broadcasting unprotected speech could expose the provider to secondary liability or regulatory action, and it violates the principle of responsible dissemination of information. Finally, recommending that the provider simply refuse service without explaining the legal basis for such refusal is unprofessional and unhelpful. While refusal might be a last resort, a professional should always strive to educate the client about the relevant legal framework, particularly when the refusal is based on constitutional grounds. This approach fails to provide the client with the necessary understanding to potentially modify their content to be compliant. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Alabama's communications sector should adopt a framework that prioritizes informed consent and proactive legal guidance. This involves 1. Understanding the client's intent and the nature of the proposed content. 2. Researching and applying relevant Alabama and federal constitutional law, particularly the First Amendment and its exceptions. 3. Clearly communicating legal limitations to the client, explaining the rationale behind them with reference to established legal standards. 4. Offering alternative, legally compliant solutions if the client's initial request is problematic. 5. Documenting all advice and client communications. This process ensures that both the provider and the client operate within legal and ethical boundaries. Question 15. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a popular online forum operating within Alabama has received numerous user-submitted posts containing strong criticisms of a proposed state legislative bill. Some of these posts express opinions that are highly critical of the bill's sponsors, using harsh language, but not rising to the level of defamation or incitement to violence. The forum's administrators are concerned about potential backlash from individuals who support the bill and are considering implementing a policy to remove all content that is critical of the bill or its proponents to avoid controversy. What is the most appropriate course of action for the forum administrators to take under Alabama law and First Amendment principles? Option A. Develop and consistently apply a clear, content-neutral policy that prohibits specific categories of speech, such as defamation, incitement to violence, and illegal content, while allowing all other user-generated content, including political criticism, to remain accessible. Option B. Proactively remove any user-generated content that uses harsh or inflammatory language when criticizing the bill or its sponsors, regardless of whether it meets the legal threshold for incitement or defamation, to maintain a more civil online environment. Option C. Immediately remove all user-generated content that expresses criticism of the proposed state legislative bill or its sponsors to preemptively avoid any potential controversy or negative feedback from bill supporters. Option D. Implement a policy that allows content critical of the bill, but requires users to disclose their political affiliations before posting such content, to provide context for other users. The correct answer is A. Develop and consistently apply a clear, content-neutral policy that prohibits specific categories of speech, such as defamation, incitement to violence, and illegal content, while allowing all other user-generated content, including political criticism, to remain accessible. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the public's right to access information and express opinions, core tenet of First Amendment rights, with the operational needs and potential liabilities of a communications provider in Alabama. The provider must navigate the complexities of content moderation and platform neutrality without infringing upon protected speech or violating applicable state and federal laws. The rapid dissemination of information in the digital age exacerbates these challenges, demanding swift and informed decision-making. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves establishing and consistently applying a clear, content-neutral policy for user-generated content that aligns with First Amendment principles and relevant Alabama law. This policy should outline prohibited content categories, e.g., incitement to violence, defamation, illegal activity, based on established legal standards, not viewpoint discrimination. The provider should then apply this policy impartially to all users and content, regardless of the political or social stance expressed. This approach ensures that the platform remains open to diverse viewpoints while mitigating legal risks by adhering to established legal boundaries for speech. The Communications Decency Act, CDA Section 230, while federal, provides significant immunity for platforms regarding third-party content. But this immunity is not absolute and can be lost if the platform actively creates or develops the offending content, or if the content falls into specific exceptions. Alabama law, while not directly regulating platform content moderation in this specific manner, operates within the framework of the First Amendment, which prohibits government censorship, and by extension, requires private entities to avoid discriminatory practices that could be construed as state action if they become sufficiently intertwined with government interests or operate as essential public forums without clear, neutral rules. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to remove all content that criticizes a specific political figure or party, even if the content does not violate established legal prohibitions against defamation, incitement, or obscenity. This constitutes viewpoint discrimination, which is a direct violation of First Amendment principles. While private platforms have some latitude, acting as a public forum or engaging in content moderation that appears to be politically motivated can lead to legal challenges and public backlash. Another incorrect approach is to allow all user-generated content without any moderation, regardless of its nature. While this might seem like an extreme form of free speech advocacy, it exposes the communications provider to significant legal liability for hosting illegal content, such as child exploitation material, incitement to imminent lawless action, or defamation. This passive approach fails to meet the responsibility of operating a communications platform in a manner that respects legal boundaries and community standards. A third incorrect approach is to selectively enforce content policies based on the perceived popularity or influence of the user posting the content. This creates an arbitrary and discriminatory environment, undermining the principle of equal treatment for all users. Such selective enforcement can be challenged as unfair and potentially discriminatory, leading to reputational damage and legal scrutiny. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field must adopt a proactive and principled approach. This involves developing robust, transparent, and content-neutral policies that are grounded in legal precedent and ethical considerations. Regular review and updating of these policies are essential to adapt to evolving legal landscapes and technological advancements. When faced with content moderation decisions, professionals should always refer back to the established policy, apply it consistently, and document their reasoning. Seeking legal counsel for complex or novel situations is also a critical component of responsible decision-making. The goal is to foster an environment that respects free expression within legal and ethical boundaries, rather than attempting to curate or suppress speech based on subjective criteria. Question 16. What factors determine whether a new cryptocurrency investment platform's advertisements, which highlight potential high returns and rapid market growth, constitute protected commercial speech under Alabama law, or if they are subject to regulatory action for being potentially misleading? Option A. Whether the advertisements promise any return on investment, regardless of disclaimers. Option B. Whether the advertisements are published by a company based outside of Alabama. Option C. Whether the advertisements are truthful and not misleading, the state's substantial interest in protecting investors, whether the regulation directly advances that interest, and if the regulation is no more extensive than necessary. Option D. Whether the advertisements use complex financial jargon that the average consumer might not understand. The correct answer is C. Whether the advertisements are truthful and not misleading, the state's substantial interest in protecting investors, whether the regulation directly advances that interest, and if the regulation is no more extensive than necessary. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing a business's right to advertise its services with the Alabama state government's interest in protecting consumers from potentially misleading or harmful commercial speech. The core of the challenge lies in determining where legitimate advertising ends and deceptive or unprotected speech begins, particularly when dealing with emerging technologies and services. Careful judgment is required to avoid both overregulation that stifles legitimate business and underregulation that leaves consumers vulnerable. The best approach involves a thorough analysis of the commercial speech's content and context against the established legal tests for regulating such speech in Alabama. This means evaluating whether the advertisement is truthful and not misleading, whether the government has a substantial interest in regulating the speech, whether the regulation directly advances that interest, and whether the regulation is no more extensive than necessary to serve that interest. This multi-pronged analysis, rooted in the principles of commercial speech protection and regulation, ensures that any potential restrictions are narrowly tailored and serve a legitimate governmental purpose without unduly infringing on First Amendment rights as interpreted within Alabama's legal framework. An incorrect approach would be to immediately assume that any advertisement for a novel service is inherently deceptive or harmful. This fails to acknowledge the presumption of constitutionality afforded to commercial speech and bypasses the necessary legal tests. Such an approach risks arbitrary enforcement and could lead to the suppression of legitimate businesses. Another incorrect approach is to focus solely on the potential for consumer harm without considering the substantial government interest and direct advancement prongs of the legal test. While consumer protection is a valid government interest, the regulation must be demonstrably effective in advancing that interest and must be narrowly tailored. Ignoring these elements can lead to regulations that are overly broad and ineffective. Finally, an approach that prioritizes the business's desire for unfettered advertising without any consideration for potential consumer deception or public interest is also professionally unacceptable. While commercial speech is protected, it is not absolute and can be regulated to prevent fraud and protect the public. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with a presumption of legality for commercial speech. They must then meticulously apply the relevant legal tests, considering the specific facts of the advertisement, the nature of the product or service, and the potential impact on consumers. This systematic evaluation ensures that decisions are grounded in law and ethical consideration, promoting both business freedom and consumer welfare within the bounds of Alabama law. Question 17. Strategic planning requires a communications firm in Alabama to advise a political candidate on their upcoming advertising campaign. The candidate wants to run several television and radio advertisements that highlight their opponent's voting record. The candidate has provided draft scripts that, while factually accurate regarding the votes, use emotionally charged language and imply that the opponent's actions were solely motivated by personal gain, without providing direct evidence of such motivation. The candidate also wishes to omit any explicit statement identifying who paid for the advertisements, arguing that their name is prominent throughout the ad. What is the most appropriate course of action for the communications firm to ensure compliance with Alabama communications law and ethical standards? Option A. Advise the candidate to revise the advertisements to include a clear and conspicuous statement identifying the candidate or committee that authorized and paid for the advertisement, and to ensure the language, while persuasive, does not present unsubstantiated personal motivations as fact. Option B. Proceed with running the advertisements as drafted, assuming the candidate's name appearing in the ad sufficiently identifies the sponsor, and that emotionally charged language is permissible in political discourse. Option C. Inform the candidate that the firm cannot create or disseminate advertisements that present potentially unsubstantiated personal motivations as fact, but will proceed with the advertisements if the candidate insists, as the ultimate responsibility lies with the candidate. Option D. Advise the candidate to use vague phrasing like "paid for by supporters" to identify the source of funding, and to focus solely on the emotional impact of the opponent's voting record. The correct answer is A. Advise the candidate to revise the advertisements to include a clear and conspicuous statement identifying the candidate or committee that authorized and paid for the advertisement, and to ensure the language, while persuasive, does not present unsubstantiated personal motivations as fact. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a communications firm in Alabama due to the sensitive nature of political speech and the potential for regulatory scrutiny. The firm must navigate the delicate balance between providing effective client services and adhering to Alabama's specific regulations governing political advertising and communications, particularly concerning disclosure requirements and the prohibition of deceptive practices. Missteps can lead to significant penalties, reputational damage, and erosion of public trust. Careful judgment is required to ensure all communications are compliant and ethically sound. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough review of all proposed campaign advertisements against the Alabama Election Code, specifically focusing on sections 17-13-1 through 17-13-10, which address political advertising and require clear identification of the sponsor. This approach ensures that the advertisements explicitly state the name of the candidate or committee that authorized and paid for the advertisement, thereby complying with disclosure mandates and preventing misleading impressions about the source of the political message. This direct adherence to statutory requirements is the most robust method for ensuring legal compliance and ethical transparency in political speech. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves proceeding with the advertisements without explicit sponsor identification, relying on the assumption that the candidate's name appearing in the ad is sufficient. This fails to meet the explicit disclosure requirements of the Alabama Election Code, which mandates a clear statement of authorization and payment. This omission can be interpreted as an attempt to obscure the true source of the political message, potentially violating prohibitions against deceptive political advertising. Another incorrect approach is to advise the candidate to use vague or misleading language about the source of funding, such as paid for by concerned citizens. This directly contravenes the spirit and letter of Alabama's disclosure laws, which aim to inform the public about who is attempting to influence their vote. Such vagueness is a form of deceptive practice and undermines the transparency expected in political discourse. A further incorrect approach is to ignore the candidate's request for potentially misleading content, believing that the candidate's intent is paramount. While client satisfaction is important, a communications firm has a professional and legal obligation to ensure that its services do not facilitate illegal or unethical activities. Advising or creating content that violates Alabama law, even at client's behest, exposes the firm to liability and ethical breaches. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and ethical integrity above all else. This involves 1. Understanding the specific regulatory landscape of the jurisdiction, Alabama in this case, particularly concerning political speech and advertising. 2. Conducting a comprehensive review of all proposed content against applicable laws and ethical guidelines. 3. Clearly communicating legal and ethical limitations to clients, even when it may be unpopular. 4. Refusing to engage in or facilitate activities that violate regulations or ethical standards. 5. Documenting all advice and decisions to ensure accountability. Question 18. System analysis indicates a group of activists in Birmingham, Alabama, plans to conduct a silent protest in a public park, holding signs with controversial political messages and wearing armbands with a specific symbol. While the protest is intended to be peaceful and non-disruptive, local business owners have expressed concerns about potential negative impacts on tourism and customer traffic. Considering Alabama communications law, what is the most appropriate course of action for local authorities to take regarding this planned demonstration? Option A. Immediately prohibit the demonstration to prevent any potential negative economic impact on local businesses and to avoid any possibility of public disorder, regardless of the nature of the activist's message. Option B. Conduct a thorough legal analysis to determine if the activist's conduct constitutes protected symbolic speech under Alabama law, considering the communicative intent, the context of the demonstration, and the potential for disruption, while also exploring reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions if necessary. Option C. Allow the demonstration to proceed without any oversight or consideration of potential public safety issues, as any restriction on a public gathering would be a violation of free speech principles. Option D. Issue a permit for the demonstration only if the activists agree to remove their controversial signs and armbands, thereby ensuring that the message conveyed does not cause offense or economic concern to local businesses. Correct answer is B. Conduct a thorough legal analysis to determine if the activist's conduct constitutes protected symbolic speech under Alabama law, considering the communicative intent, the context of the demonstration, and the potential for disruption, while also exploring reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions if necessary. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the protection of public discourse and individual expression under Alabama law with the need to maintain order and prevent disruption. The core issue is determining when expressive conduct, even if symbolic, crosses the line from protected speech to conduct that can be regulated. Careful judgment is required to avoid both overreach that stifles legitimate expression and underreach that permits genuine harm or significant disruption. The correct approach involves a nuanced application of Alabama's interpretation of First Amendment principles as applied to symbolic speech. This means evaluating the intent of the speaker, the context of the communication, and the potential impact of the conduct. Specifically, it requires assessing whether the conduct is inherently communicative and whether the government's interest in regulating the conduct is unrelated to the suppression of free expression. In this case, the most appropriate approach is to analyze the conduct under the framework established by Alabama courts when considering symbolic speech, which often involves a balancing test. This approach prioritizes a thorough, context-specific legal analysis to determine if the expressive conduct is protected. An incorrect approach would be to immediately prohibit the demonstration based solely on the potential for disruption or the controversial nature of the message. This fails to recognize that protected speech, including symbolic speech, can sometimes be disruptive or unpopular. Such an approach risks chilling legitimate expression and violating constitutional protections. Another incorrect approach would be to allow the demonstration to proceed without any consideration of potential public safety or order concerns, simply because it is framed as symbolic speech. While symbolic speech is protected, it is not absolute and can be subject to reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions, or outright prohibition if it incites violence or constitutes a direct threat. Ignoring these potential consequences is a failure of professional responsibility. Finally, an approach that focuses solely on the subjective offense taken by some members of the public, without a deeper legal analysis of the conduct's communicative intent and impact, is also flawed. While public reaction is a factor in assessing disruption, it cannot be the sole determinant of whether symbolic speech is protected or can be regulated. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the specific facts and circumstances of the expressive conduct. This involves identifying the communicative intent, the nature of the conduct, and the potential impact on public order and safety. The next step is to consult relevant Alabama statutes and case law concerning symbolic speech and the First Amendment. This legal research will inform the application of established legal tests, such as whether the conduct is inherently expressive and whether the government's interest is content neutral. This analytical process allows for a reasoned decision that respects constitutional rights while also addressing legitimate governmental concerns. Question 19. The monitoring system demonstrates an employer's attempt to track employee productivity and communications within the workplace. Considering Alabama communications law, which of the following approaches to implementing and utilizing such a system best navigates the potential for privacy tort claims? Option A. Implement the monitoring system with a clear, written policy that is distributed to all employees, detailing the types of communications monitored, the purpose of the monitoring, and the extent of data retention, ensuring all monitoring is directly related to legitimate business interests. Option B. Monitor employee personal social media accounts accessed on company devices to gather information about their off-duty conduct. Option C. Install hidden cameras in break rooms and private offices to capture all employee conversations and activities, regardless of business relevance. Option D. Begin monitoring all employee email and internet usage immediately without informing employees, as the company owns the equipment and network. The correct answer is A. Implement the monitoring system with a clear, written policy that is distributed to all employees, detailing the types of communications monitored, the purpose of the monitoring, and the extent of data retention, ensuring all monitoring is directly related to legitimate business interests. Explanation. The monitoring system demonstrates a scenario that is professionally challenging due to the inherent tension between a company's desire to monitor employee productivity and the employee's right to privacy. In Alabama, as in many jurisdictions, the legal landscape surrounding employee privacy is complex and often involves balancing these competing interests. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any monitoring practices comply with Alabama law and avoid potential tort claims. The best professional approach involves implementing a monitoring system that is narrowly tailored to legitimate business purposes and includes clear, conspicuous notice to employees. This approach is correct because Alabama law, while permitting some forms of employee monitoring, generally requires that such monitoring not be overly intrusive and that employees are aware of the surveillance. Providing explicit notice of the monitoring system, its scope, and its purpose allows employees to understand the expectations and limitations of their privacy in the workplace. This proactive communication helps mitigate claims of intrusion upon seclusion, a tort that requires an offensive intrusion into a person's private affairs. By being transparent, the employer demonstrates a commitment to respecting employee privacy within the bounds of legitimate business operations, thereby reducing the likelihood of a successful tort claim. An approach that involves monitoring employee communications without any prior notification to employees is professionally unacceptable. This failure to inform employees about the surveillance directly contravenes the principle of reasonable expectation of privacy and can lead to claims of intrusion upon seclusion. Alabama courts consider the reasonableness of the intrusion, and secret monitoring is generally viewed as unreasonable and highly intrusive. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to monitor all employee communications indiscriminately, even those unrelated to business operations, without a clear and compelling business justification. This broad and unfettered monitoring can extend beyond what is necessary to achieve legitimate business objectives, potentially encompassing highly personal conversations. Such overreach significantly increases the risk of an intrusion upon seclusion claim, as the employer is intruding into areas where an employee might reasonably expect privacy, even in a workplace setting. Finally, an approach that uses the collected monitoring data for purposes unrelated to the stated business justification, such as for personal vendettas or discriminatory practices, is also professionally unacceptable. While the initial monitoring might have been permissible, the subsequent misuse of the data constitutes a separate ethical and potentially legal failing. This misuse can exacerbate existing tort claims and introduce new ones, demonstrating a disregard for employee rights and professional integrity. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and ethical conduct. This involves 1. Identifying legitimate business needs for monitoring. 2. Thoroughly researching Alabama's specific laws regarding employee privacy and monitoring. 3. Developing a monitoring policy that is narrowly tailored to those needs and clearly communicated to employees. 4. Ensuring the monitoring methods are the least intrusive means to achieve the business objective. And 5. Regularly reviewing and updating policies and practices to remain compliant with evolving legal standards and ethical considerations. Question 20. The evaluation methodology shows that a media company in Mobile, Alabama, published intimate details about a local resident's medical history without their consent, which were not previously known and were highly embarrassing. The resident, a former employee of the company, claims this disclosure caused significant emotional distress and damaged their reputation, leading to lost business opportunities. The plaintiff's expert testified that the emotional distress has lasted for 18 months and is severe. The plaintiff's own testimony detailed the humiliation and anxiety experienced. The media company argues the information, while private, was of some tangential public interest due to the resident's former public-facing role. If a jury finds in favor of the plaintiff on the public disclosure of private facts claim, what is the most appropriate method for calculating compensatory damages under Alabama law, assuming economic damages for lost business opportunities are calculated at $50,000? Option A. Calculate total compensatory damages by adding the proven economic damages of $50,000 to a calculated non-economic damages amount, where non-economic damages are determined by multiplying the severity of the emotional distress, rated as high by its duration, 18 months, and then by an offensiveness factor of 1.5, reflecting the highly offensive nature of the disclosure and its limited legitimate public concern. Option B. Award damages based on the fact that private information was disclosed, without assessing whether the information was of legitimate concern to the public or highly offensive to a reasonable person. Option C. Assign a fixed sum of $100,000 for emotional distress, irrespective of the duration, severity, or offensiveness of the disclosure, and add it to the economic damages. Option D. Award damages solely based on the media company's potential profit from the article, without considering the plaintiff's specific harm or emotional distress. The correct answer is A. Calculate total compensatory damages by adding the proven economic damages of $50,000 to a calculated non-economic damages amount, where non-economic damages are determined by multiplying the severity of the emotional distress, rated as high, by its duration, 18 months, and then by an offensiveness factor of 1.5, reflecting the highly offensive nature of the disclosure and its limited legitimate public concern. Explanation: the evaluation methodology shows that determining the appropriate damages for a public disclosure of private facts claim under Alabama law presents a significant implementation challenge. Professionals must balance the plaintiff's right to privacy and compensation for harm against the defendant's right to free expression, and the practical difficulties in quantifying intangible emotional distress. The challenge lies in applying Alabama's specific legal standards for highly offensive to a reasonable person, and not of legitimate concern to the public, in a manner that is both legally sound and ethically defensible, particularly when financial figures are involved. The correct approach involves a meticulous calculation of damages that directly addresses the elements of the tort as defined by Alabama case law. This includes quantifying any proven economic losses, such as lost employment opportunities or reputational damage that can be assigned a monetary value. Crucially, it also requires a reasoned estimation of non-economic damages, such as emotional distress, humiliation, and mental anguish. This estimation should be grounded in evidence presented, such as expert testimony from mental health professionals, the plaintiff's own testimony regarding the severity and duration of their suffering, and any corroborating evidence of the impact on their life. The calculation should reflect the degree of offensiveness of the disclosure and the extent to which the disclosed information was truly private and not of legitimate public concern, as per Alabama Code Section 13A 11-7. The formula for calculating compensatory damages would generally follow: total compensatory damages equals backslash text economic damages plus text non-economic damages backslash, where economic damages equals backslash sum I equals 1n text lost income I plus sum j equals 1m text reputational harm cost j non-economic damages equals backslash text severity of distress times text duration of distress times text offensiveness factor The offensiveness factor would be a multiplier derived from the egregiousness of the disclosure and its impact on a reasonable person in Alabama, informed by precedent. An incorrect approach would be to solely focus on the potential financial gain the defendant may have achieved from the disclosure, without adequately accounting for the plaintiff's actual harm. This fails to address the core compensatory purpose of damages in a tort claim, which is to make the injured party whole. Alabama law prioritizes compensating the victim for their suffering and losses, not merely disgorging ill-gotten gains from the defendant. Another incorrect approach would be to arbitrarily assign a monetary value to emotional distress without any evidentiary basis or a clear link to the offensiveness of the disclosure and its impact. This lacks the reasoned estimation required by Alabama law and risks being perceived as speculative or punitive, rather than compensatory. The calculation must be tethered to the specific facts of the case and the demonstrable harm suffered by the plaintiff. A further incorrect approach would be to ignore the not of legitimate concern to the public element and award damages based solely on the fact that private information was disclosed. Alabama law requires that the disclosed information be of a nature that a reasonable person would find highly offensive and that it not be of legitimate concern to the public. Failure to consider this defense renders the damage calculation legally flawed. The professional decision-making process for such situations requires a thorough understanding of Alabama's privacy torts, including the elements of public disclosure of private facts and the defenses available. Professionals must gather all relevant evidence, consult with legal counsel regarding applicable Alabama statutes and case law, and employ a systematic approach to damage calculation that is both legally justifiable and ethically sound, ensuring that the award fairly compensates the plaintiff for their proven injuries.